Cabin 28 by hrhdaf. When I was about 16, my family had a holiday in California to visit relatives. I kinda got friendly with one of the neighborhood kids. His name was Brett, and he was a couple of years older than me. On this particular day, Brett had decided that we should go hike through the countryside. My parents had no objections, having been assured that Brett knew the area like the back of his hand. We had our sleeping bags and a tent with us. Our plan was to find somewhere in the woods to set up camp for the night. Or at least I thought it was. But looking back, I think Brett had other plans all along. As it got towards evening, we ended up at this place. I don't know how to describe it. It looked kinda like a holiday place and had all these wooden cabins, except that they were all a bit shabby. Not somewhere you'd really want to go on holiday, if you know what I mean. Some of them looked empty, and some were boarded up, but there was what sounded like a party going on in one of them. Anyway, it had started to rain, and Brett suggested that we find an empty one and sneak in for the night, rather than putting up the tent. I should have realized right there that something was off, because we walked past at least 2 cabins that would have done just fine before he finally settled on one. I could tell he was excited about it. If anything, it looked more dilapidated than the rest. Its yellow and white paint was peeling off, and there was a number 28 next to the front door. Brett yanked on it as hard as he could, but he couldn't get it to move. The windows were all boarded up, so we made our way around the back. The ground dropped away at the back of the cabin, and there were a couple of what looked like basement rooms that seemed completely separate from the rest of the house. In front of them, leading up to the back door, were rickety wooden stairs. Brett tried this door, and surprisingly, it swung open without effort. There was a small porch that led into what was clearly a kitchen. "Let's just dump our stuff in here," and he dropped his backpack onto the kitchen floor. I followed suit, and piled my backpack and our tiny tent into a heap with his, and followed him further into the cabin. The kitchen led to a living room on the right, and a tiny passageway on the left with a door in it to the bathroom. At either end of the passageway were 2 more doors. The living room was decorated with an off-white paper, covered in tiny flowers with green stems and blue blossoms. There were curtains still hanging in the windows, in a very 70s style orange, and against one of the walls was a sofa. There was an odd, acrid smell in the room, and the walls seemed to have sprouted black mold all over them. I shuddered involuntarily. "This is going to be great for my asthma," I muttered. But Brett had already headed into the bedroom on the left. It was completely empty, and he seemed disappointed. We made our way to the room on the right. Again, it was empty. "I think we should sleep in the living room," he said. "Yeah, if I want to spend the night having asthma attacks," I said sarcastically. "Let's sleep in here. It feels warmer than the rest of the place, and there's no mold." He looked disappointed, but could obviously tell my mind was made up. He shrugged and went and grabbed his sleeping bag. I grabbed mine, and we set up camp in the bedroom. There was a large closet in the room, which I briefly explored, but there was nothing in it but a couple of empty beer cans. Apparently, we weren't the first to have this idea. We chatted for a while, and had something to eat and drink. Before I knew it, my eyelids were heavy. Brett's father had dropped us off somewhere called Feather Falls early in the morning, and we'd walked all day. By 10 o'clock, I was dead to the world. I awoke to the sound of a muffled scream coming up from the living room. My eyes shot open, but before I could move, I felt a small, cold hand clamp itself over my mouth. That touch froze me to my very core, and my limbs were suddenly like lead.
"Shh! Pretend you're asleep. If they know you're awake, they'll kill you,"
a voice whispered next to me. As my wide eyes adjusted to the dark, I could see a small girl kneeling next to me. She looked around 10 years old and very slight, but her pale eyes looked older. I nodded my understanding to her, and slowly she moved her hand away. I glanced at Brett, but he was still sleeping soundly. There was another muffled scream from the living room, and a woman's voice, then the sound of crying. Then suddenly, I heard more voices. It sounded like teenage boys arguing. There were odd pauses in the yelling, as I thought I was only hearing half the conversation. The girl put her finger to her lips as if to remind me to be quiet. It sounded like all hell was breaking loose in the living room. There were sickening noises, like the sound of someone bashing steak with a meat hammer. I don't know how long it went on for, but it felt like forever. It was at this point that I realized I was holding her small, cold hand. I was grabbing onto this tiny girl as though my life depended on it. Tears slid down her face as she whispered, "It's almost over now. I have to go, but you have to stay here." And there was such sadness in the way she said it, I realized that I was crying too. With that, she got up and walked out the door, and utter silence filled the cabin. I wanted with all my being to believe it was a dream, but I knew I hadn't imagined it. I tried shaking Brett, but I couldn't wake him. He was breathing deeply and seemed to be in a very sound sleep. Suddenly, I had that old familiar feeling of my lungs clamping shut. I realized I'd been holding my breath for almost an hour, and the stress and panic had brought on one of my asthma attacks. I scrabbled around the floor, and then realized I left my backpack in the kitchen, complete with my inhaler. I tried to control my breathing to see if it eased it, but it began to get worse, and suddenly I knew I had no choice. If I didn't go and get it, I might end up dead anyway. Comforting myself with the thought that there hadn't been any noises in the cabin for a while, I crept out of my sleeping bag and out the door towards the kitchen. I felt my way around the walls in the dark, praying I wouldn't make a noise. But the cabin sounded utterly quiet and empty. In the distance, I could hear the sounds of a party coming from one of the other cabins. I grabbed my inhaler and quickly used it. My lungs began to open, and finally, I could take a proper breath. The smell in there was disgusting. I was satisfied there was no one in the cabin anymore. If there had been, I'm pretty certain they'd have heard me already. I grabbed a flashlight from my backpack and made my way toward the bedroom. As the light swung over the living room floor, I stopped dead in my tracks. As long as I live, I will never forget that sight. On the floor were 3 bodies. One by the sofa was covered with a blanket, and the other 2, teenage boys, were lying on the floor. They had clearly been bludgeoned and stabbed. There was blood everywhere, even up the walls. There was no sign of the little girl, though. That's when I lost it. I went plowing into the bedroom.
Brett, wake the hell up!
I was just about pulling him out of his sleeping bag. This time he woke easily.
They're dead. All of them.
I croaked.
What? You actually saw something?
I had no idea what he was talking about, and in that moment, I didn't care. Babbling incoherently and practically dragging him by the arm, I pulled him into the living room. My mouth fell open. There was nothing there. The walls were covered in wood paneling. The flowery wallpaper was gone, and there were no curtains. There was no sofa. Definitely no bodies.
Honestly, Brett,
I was almost sobbing again.
There were bodies, 3 of them. The room's all changed.
Brett looked at me dubiously.
Someone told you about this place, didn't they? Nobody told me anything. I don't know anyone here, do I, dumbass? There was wallpaper and a sofa.
I trailed off. No, there wasn't, he hissed, and I could sense the panic beginning to rise in his voice.
This room was empty, and there wasn't any wallpaper.
I was dumbstruck. Clearly, Brett hadn't seen the room as I had seen it. I just want to get the hell out of here. And I barged past him into the kitchen. I grabbed my backpack and stumbled down the back stairs in the dark. Brett followed closely behind me. We half ran and half stumbled to the cabin where the sounds of partying were coming from, and banged on the door. A very drunk, very pretty girl answered it, and we asked if we could use the phone. She took one look at our pale faces and gave a low whistle.
You been in cabin 28, ain't ya?
We nodded dumbly. I called my dad, and within an hour we were in the car heading home. I could feel the anger coming from the driver's seat on the journey home. My dad wasn't exactly pleased with being disturbed in the early hours. Brett and I spoke very little in the car. I did mention to him how hard it had been to wake him up, and he looked at me with these tortured eyes.
I could hear you, but I couldn't wake up. I was dreaming I was trapped under the floorboards in a little wooden house. It's the most terrifying dream I've ever had in my life.
And he shuddered. I never saw him again after that night. The next day I was sick, and by the time I was feeling better, it was time to go back home. At the time this took place, I had no internet, so the memories of that night were unexplained for a long time. Brett never told me where we'd gone, but I've always felt our visit there was no accident. I think he wanted to check it out and, in me, found someone completely ignorant of the history of the place. Recently, however, I checked out Cabin 28 online. I read about the gruesome murder of a woman and her son and his friend, and the disappearance of her 12-year-old daughter, whose bones were later found near Feather Falls. I read about the children that slept through the whole thing in the bedroom Brett and I had occupied that night. What really got me, though, was a crime scene photo I came across of the wall in the cabin. A photo of pale walls with a small floral pattern of green stems and blue blossoms.